For centuries, it has been said that a magical sword was plunged into a stone, waiting for the destined king. But what if I told you that Excalibur was not only real, but could still be hidden somewhere in England? The story of Excalibur is one of the most famous in all of British mythology. Its mere mention conjures images of medieval castles, knights in shining armor, powerful sorcerers, and a destiny written by the gods. But as a historian, I invite you to look beyond the myth, beyond the legend. What is true about all this? Could there have been a real sword that inspired the myth? Let's start with the basics. What is Excalibur? In short, Excalibur is the legendary sword of King Arthur. There are versions that say it was pulled from a stone, others that it was given by a magical lady who lived in a lake. Some legends describe it as indestructible, capable of cutting iron like butter, and with a blinding shine. In others, it is simply a powerful sword but not magical. The interesting thing is that Excalibur does not appear in the oldest tales of the Arthurian cycle. Instead, the first sword associated with Arthur had no name. It was centuries later, when poets and chroniclers began to embellish the story, that Ceolwch was born, its first Welsh name, which later transformed into the Latinized name Excalibur. But here's the detail most people ignore. There are archaeological records of real swords from the 5th century that could coincide with Arthur's time. And one of them was found in a lake. To truly understand Excalibur, we must first immerse ourselves in Celtic culture. The Celts, present in what is now Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and parts of England, believed that certain objects, especially the weapons of great warriors, possessed magical or spiritual powers. In the oldest Celtic tales, there are references to magical swords such as Fragarac or Cleam Solace. These weapons were imbued with divine power, and were often used by demigod heroes. Thus, when the stories of King Arthur began to be compiled in the 8th and 9th centuries, the monks who transcribed them mixed Christianity with Celtic pagan folklore. From that fusion, a sword was born that was not only powerful, it was sacred. Two names are key to understanding how the legend of Excalibur was transformed into what we know today. Geoffrey of Monmouth in his 12th century work Historia Regum Britanniae mentions Arthur, but not Excalibur as such. It did not yet have that name. But he does speak of a prodigious sword that the king carried in battle, called Caliban. Thomas Malory in his 15th century work Le Morte d'Arthur already gives shape to the story we know: the sword in the stone, the Lady of the Lake, the oath of the Knights of the Round Table. Excalibur, in Malory's version, shines brightly when unsheathed, and its scabbard has the power to prevent its wielder from bleeding, even if wounded. Here a great question arises that divides scholars of the myth. Is the sword that Arthur pulls from the stone the same one given to him by the Lady of the Lake? In Le Morte d'Arthur they are two different swords. Arthur breaks the first in a battle and, afterward, receives a new and more powerful one from the magical world. This has led to the thought that the sword in the stone symbolizes the divine right to rule, while Excalibur represents the power and protection of the spiritual world. Many experts believe that this separation of swords reflects a literary evolution. First, the sword was just a test of royalty. Then, it became a magical artifact that connected the king with the supernatural. Now let's talk about facts. Historically, there was a period of time, around 500 AD, in which Great Britain was plunged into chaos after the withdrawal of the Roman Empire. The Saxons were invading from the east, the Celtic peoples were resisting from the west. It was in that power vacuum that the legendary figure of a great warrior leader emerged. His name? No one knows for sure. But it could have been Ambrosius Aurelianus Riothamus, or perhaps a local chieftain whose name was forgotten, but whose exploits inspired the Arthurian myth. This leader probably possessed a ceremonial sword, given by some druid or prominent blacksmith. In ancient times, a sword was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of power, an almost sacred object. And here comes the surprising thing. In excavations near Dosmery Lake in Cornwall, remains of ancient swords were found, sheathed and placed with great care. One in particular was oriented towards the west as if pointing towards a lost kingdom. Where could Excalibur be today? If a sword that inspired the legend of Excalibur really existed, it was probably melted down, buried, or thrown into a lake as part of a Celtic ritual. And that is not a simple conjecture. In many lakes in Europe, weapons from the Iron Age have been found, carefully deposited at the bottom. For the Celts, throwing a sword into the water was a way of returning it to the gods. Therefore, the story of the Lady of the Lake would not be a pure invention, but a poetic reinterpretation of a very real religious practice. Excalibur was not born as a magical sword, but as an object of symbolic power, rooted in Celtic traditions, elevated by medieval poetry, and finally transformed into a modern legend. And yet, there are real material clues that suggest that something, a special sword, a legendary leader, a consecrated lake, may have existed. So the next time you hear the word Excalibur, remember, it's not just a legend. It's about how history and mythology intertwine to build the pillars of a culture. And that's just the beginning. In the next chapter we will delve into who the real King Arthur was, if he existed. Was he really a king, or a simple Roman warrior forgotten by history? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because we are going to unearth the truth behind one of the greatest myths of the West. Millions believe that King Arthur was a legendary figure. But there are Roman documents that mention a Briton commander with a wrought iron sword who led a last resistance. What if Arthur wasn't a myth, but a man of flesh and blood? When we talk about King Arthur, most people think of castles, epic battles, and the famous sword Excalibur. But, did Arthur as a historical person really exist? Or was he a literary construct that combined several ancient leaders into a single idealized figure? For centuries, historians and archaeologists have debated this question, trying to separate the grain of legend from the chaff of reality. The search for the true Arthur is not just an exercise in scholarship. It is an attempt to understand the soul of a nation that still seeks its heroic roots. And the curious thing is that, if we follow the right clues, we find fragments of truth between the lines of medieval chronicles. A 6th century Latin text mentions a Briton commander who repelled a Saxon invasion in a battle that could be the true Battle of Camlin. Could we be facing the authentic historical Arthur? In the oldest texts, Arthur does not appear as a king or even as a nobleman. In fact, the first mentions describe him as a dux bellorum, a military leader. This term comes from Latin and was used to describe regional chieftains who were not necessarily kings, but who led troops in times of war. The key text is the Historia Britanum, written in the 9th century by Nennius. There it is mentioned that Arthur led the Britons against the Saxon invaders in 12 battles, the most important being that of Mount Badon. This event is not only part of the myth, it was real. Several texts mention it, including authors like Gildas, who lived just a generation after the event. Now, Gildas never mentions Arthur by name, but he does talk about a great commander who stopped the Saxon advance for decades. If that commander wasn't Arthur, who was he? This is where things get interesting. Some scholars suggest that Arthur could have been a combination of several historical figures. Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Roman Briton nobleman who led the resistance after the fall of the Roman Empire in Britain. Rhyothemis, a military leader who traveled to Gaul, modern-day France, with a Briton army and was betrayed by the Romans. Lucius Artorius Castus, a 2nd century Roman official whose career was documented in inscriptions found in Croatia and whose life has certain similarities to the myth. It is possible that over time the medieval monks, by mixing local legends, oral chronicles and ancient texts, created a unified figure that condensed the exploits of all of them. From that amalgam, the Arthur we know today was born. The Battle of Mount Badon is one of the keys to understanding the context in which Arthur could have emerged. It is estimated to have occurred between 490 and 520 AD, and was one of the few significant victories of the Britons against the Saxons. The victory not only stopped the enemy advance, but marked the beginning of a period of peace that lasted almost 50 years. Some archaeologists place the battle site in Bath, while others point to Badbury Rings. There is no consensus. What there is, however, is evidence of a great conflict at that time. Remains of weapons, reinforced fortifications, and layers of ash that indicate fires and destruction. The famous city of Camelot, home of Arthur and center of the mythical court of the Round Table, does not appear in the first texts. Its first mention occurs in the 12th century, in works by the French poet Chrétien de Troyes. Before that, neither Nennius nor Gildas speak of a city with that name. Some believe that Camelot could be inspired by Cadbury Castle, an ancient Iron Age fortress located in Somerset. Excavations there have revealed structures and walls dating from the post-Roman period, as well as remains of banquets and luxury ceramics, indicating that it could have been a center of power. The same site was identified on ancient maps with the name Camelot, which has further fueled the theory. At this point, a fundamental question must be asked. Does it really matter if Arthur existed or not? For many, yes. Because if Arthur was real, then his legend represents something more than a simple story of chivalry. It represents the struggle of a people to survive in the face of invasion, hope in dark times, the possibility that a just leader can change the destiny of a nation. And for medieval kings, it was a tool of legitimacy. To say that one descended from Arthur was like claiming the divine right to the throne. That is why his figure continued to be promoted for centuries, even when there was no conclusive proof of his existence. Today, archaeologists from all over the world continue to search for clues of the historical Arthur. Excavations in Tintagel, Glastonbury, Winchester, and other sites considered Arthurian have yielded fascinating findings, but no definitive proof. However, one should not underestimate the power of legend. Often, oral stories hold hidden truths, disguised as fantasy. Perhaps the real Arthur was an anonymous leader, elevated by the collective memory until he became the eternal symbol of the good ruler. The Arthur of flesh and blood, if he existed, was not the perfect king that literature shows us, but was probably a Briton chieftain who defended his land with courage and strategy. His figure was transformed by the centuries, adorned by bards, chroniclers, and kings until he became an immortal myth. And the most incredible thing is that his story does not end here. There is still much to discover. In the next chapter, we are going to thoroughly analyze how the legend of the sword in the stone was born. Was it a political metaphor? A lost Celtic ritual? Or simply a literary creation with roots much deeper than you think? Subscribe and join me on this journey through history and myth, because the best of Excalibur is yet to be told. Imagine this, a sword plunged into a rock, impossible to extract, except by an. It's not just a story. In the Middle Ages, there were real rituals where swords were plunged into stone altars during ceremonies for kings and warriors. Is it possible that the myth was born from a real ritual act? We all know the image, a gleaming sword plunged into a stone, surrounded by nobles, peasants, and clerics. One by one they try to pull it out, and fail. Until a young, seemingly insignificant boy pulls it out with ease. That scene, repeated countless times in books, movies, and TV shows, is one of the most powerful symbols in Western literature. But few stop to ask, where does this idea come from? Who invented the story of the sword in the stone, and why did it have such a cultural impact for more than 800 years? In this chapter we are going to unravel the deep origin of that symbol. We will examine medieval texts, ritual practices, Celtic symbolism, and even political maneuvers that could explain how a simple image became the foundational act of the Arthurian myth. There is a church in Tuscany, Italy, where a real sword has been embedded in a rock for over 800 years. It was placed there by a knight who renounced war after a divine vision. Is it proof that the myth of the sword in the stone is not only real but universal? Although Excalibur was already known before the 12th century, the first time the motif of the sword in the stone appears is in the work of the French poet Robert de Boron, around the year 1190. In his poem Merlin, Robert introduces the idea that the sword magically appears plunged into a stone or an anvil, with the inscription, "He who can pull this sword from the stone shall be the rightful king of England." This detail was not in the previous tales. Geoffrey of Monmouth, for example, never mentioned this magical test. So why did Robert de Boron add this scene? The answer could lie in medieval investiture practices, and in the role of the church in legitimizing power. In medieval Europe, many religious ceremonies used symbolic elements to represent divine will. Among them, swords and stones occupied a very special place. The sword symbolized military power and the ability to rule. The stone symbolized permanence, justice, and divine right. In many coronations, it was common for the king's ceremonial weapon to be presented on a stone altar. The act of taking the sword, and not just receiving it, was part of the rite that demonstrated the monarch's authority. It was not uncommon for these swords to be fixed or held in stone or metal structures in some monasteries. Pulling them out required strength and faith. It is possible that Robert de Boron transformed this royal rite into a miraculous act, endowing it with a magical character thanks to the addition of the wizard Merlin. In the Abbey of Montesipi near Siena, Italy, there is a sword plunged into a stone. It is not a sculpture. It is a real sword of medieval forging, deeply embedded in a limestone rock. It was placed there in the year 1180 by a knight named Galgano Guidati, who, after a vision, decided to abandon his life of violence and dedicate it to God. Legend has it that, as a symbol of his conversion, he plunged his sword into the stone, and it sank as if it were butter. Years later, the story was canonized by the church, and San Galgano was declared a saint. The place became a pilgrimage site, and the sword still remains there, protected by a glass case. This episode occurred approximately a decade before Robert de Boron wrote his poem. Coincidence? Or was it the direct inspiration for the Arthurian myth? Many experts think that Boron may have heard of the story of the Italian knight, very famous in his time, and adapted it for his Arthurian legend, adding a political dimension. Let's not forget that, in the Middle Ages, succession to the throne was not automatic. Many times kings were chosen or legitimized through divine signs. A vision, a prophecy, a miracle. Everything served to justify the right of one candidate over others. The act of pulling the sword from the stone is exactly that, an allegory of the divine right to rule. The young Arthur, raised as a commoner, pulls out the sword that no one else could move. At that moment, his bloodline and his lineage do not matter, but that he has been chosen by destiny, or by God. In a world where the nobility competed for power, that story offered a clear message. Legitimate power is not inherited, it is proven. In Robert de Boron's poem, Merlin is the one who organizes the test. He places the sword in the stone, and it is he who proclaims that only the legitimate king will be able to pull it out. This makes him more than a wizard, it positions him as an agent of destiny. Merlin is the bridge between the human world and the divine. He does not act on a whim, but as the executor of a much larger plan. In that sense, he also represents the medieval church, an intermediary between God and men who legitimizes the power of kings. This detail reinforces the idea that the sword in the stone was not just a narrative symbol, but a coded political message, aimed at a medieval audience that perfectly understood what it meant. Don't miss it. Subscribe and join me at the heart of the myth. Because behind every legend, there is a real story waiting to be discovered. A female hand emerges from the lake, holding a gleaming sword. She says not a word, but with her gesture she changes the destiny of an entire kingdom. Who was the Lady of the Lake really? A forgotten deity, a Celtic priestess, or the last guardian of an ancient power? What is clear is this: we are not dealing with a minor character, but with a deep echo of ancient religious traditions, transformed by medieval literature into a figure that reflects the tension between the feminine, the magical, and the sacred. But pay attention. In ancient Celtic legends there is a water goddess, named Coventina, who was worshipped in British springs and represented delivering objects to humans. Could the Lady of the Lake be a Christianized version of a forbidden pagan goddess? In the Arthurian tales there are several types of women: the damsels in distress like Elaine or Guinevere, the dangerous sorceresses like Morgana. And then there is the Lady of the Lake, who doesn't quite fit into any category. She doesn't need to be rescued, nor does she act out of revenge or jealousy. She is an autonomous agent, a figure who gives and takes, who intervenes from the shadows. The Lady of the Lake, although she does not appear as such in the original Celtic sources, could be the Christianized evolution of these sacred female figures. In many of these cultures, water was seen as the womb of the earth, a space of creation and destruction, of beginning and end. It is not strange that the figure who gives the sword, a symbol of power, emerges precisely from this medium. One of the most intriguing stories about the Lady of the Lake is her connection to Merlin. In some versions, especially the French ones of the 13th century, Merlin falls in love with her, teaches her his secrets, and she, after learning everything, betrays him and locks him up forever in a cave, a tree, or a magical tower. This story has been interpreted in many ways: as a warning, the wise Merlin falls victim to his own passion; as a power inversion, the feminine is imposed on the masculine; as a symbol of transition, the ancient Mallory as a Christian shows an ambivalence towards her. He portrays her as magical and powerful, but also dangerous. This reflects the medieval conflict between the old pagan world and the dominant Christian doctrine. The Lady of the Lake represents many things at once: the hidden power, she is neither queen nor warrior, but she influences everything; ancient wisdom, she knows things that Merlin doesn't know; wild nature, her home is not a castle but a lake, unpredictable, mysterious; and most importantly, she is the guardian of power. It is not Arthur who finds the sword. It is she who gives it to him. That implies that power is not conquered, it is granted. This idea, deeply religious and spiritual, is opposed to the masculine vision of conquest and domination. In this sense, the Lady of the Lake can also be seen as a figure of justice. She gives the sword to the chosen one and claims it when that chosen one has failed. Whether as a priestess, goddess, sorceress, or water spirit, her presence in the legend of Excalibur is key. She reminds us that power, when it is not honored, must be returned. In the next chapter we will travel to the remains of Tintagel, the castle where, according to legend, Arthur was born. What have archaeologists revealed? Could it really have been the home of a post-Roman leader? Join me in the search. Because every stone has a story and every legend, a root in the earth. Tintagel. Its name evokes misty cliffs, waves crashing on black rocks, and a story written in stone and wind. For many, it is a simple castle in ruins on the edge of the Sea of Cornwall. But for millions more, it is something much deeper. the place where it all began. According to many versions of the myth, Tintagel is the site where King Arthur was conceived, thanks to the magic of Merlin and the intervention of King Uther Pendragon. But is it just a legend? What most people don't know is that Tintagel is also one of the most important archaeological sites in British history. And what has been found there in recent years is challenging centuries of skepticism. In 2016, archaeologists discovered a huge palatial building in Tintagel, dated to the 6th century, just the time when, according to the chronicles, Arthur would have lived. Could we be facing the foundations of the historical Camelot? For a long time it was believed that the visible ruins of Tintagel, the walls and the remains of towers, were simply medieval, dated to the 13th century. They were built by Richard, Earl of Cornwall, in 1233, who wanted to take advantage of the Arthurian fame of the place to increase his prestige. But under those medieval ruins, there is something much older. Since the beginning of the 20th century, excavations have been carried out, but it was only in the 21st century, especially between 2016 and 2019, that the remains of a monumental building dated between the 5th and 6th centuries were discovered. Carbon tests, ceramic analyses, and architectural remains indicate that this building was of large dimensions, at least 20 meters long by 10 meters wide. Built with sophisticated techniques for the time. Decorated with ceramics imported from the Mediterranean, luxury plates, wine vessels, and fragments of glass of Byzantine origin. Tintagel is not mentioned by name in the earliest chronicles. But the archaeological findings have filled that void. One of the most fascinating discoveries occurred in 1998. A slate slab with Latin inscriptions found among the ruins. In it, several names appear and one in particular caught the attention: Ardigno. The text says, Pater Coli Avi Ficit Ardigno, which can be interpreted as, Ardigno descendant of Col made this. Does it mean it's Arthur? No. But Ardigno is a Celtic Latin name related to art-bear, strength, the same root of the name Arthur. For some researchers, it is indirect proof that the name, and perhaps the lineage, was present in Tintagel at the correct time. Arthur may not have been born literally in Tintagel. His mother may not have been enchanted by Merlin. But what is clear is that we do not have absolute proof. But we do have something more powerful: a convergence of stories, objects, dates, and names that point to the same place. And that is the very definition of a story that is becoming real. In the next chapter we are going to delve into the enigma of Merlin. Was he a real Celtic druid, a Christian prophet, or a sage created to give soul to the myth? Join me because now we will explore the mind behind it all. Don't forget to subscribe, leave your like, and turn on notifications. The best of this story is yet to be revealed. Merlin. Just his name evokes images of long robes, white beards, hidden towers in the forests, and spells whispered in the king's ear. He is the sage of the Arthurian myth, the counselor, the sorcerer, the oracle. But he is also, probably, the most difficult character to define in this entire legend. Why? Because Merlin is, in reality, a composite construct. There is not just one Merlin. There are many. And each one was adapted, molded, and reinterpreted according to the political, religious, and literary interests of his time. In this chapter we are going to disarm that magical figure layer by layer, until we reach the heart of his legend. Was he a Celtic druid? A Christian prophet? A French invention? Or perhaps, like everything in Arthur's story, a fragmented truth that still lives in the depths of our collective memory? In a remote region of Scotland, the story is still told of a man named Lailoken, a crazy wise man who spoke. This figure is clearly based on the Celtic folklore of the crazy wise man, present in characters like Merlin Wlt, the Welsh Merlin, and Lailoken from Scotland. Both were poet-prophets, marginalized, who spoke with nature and had visions of the future. The next step in Merlin's transformation occurs in the work, Historia Regum Britanniae, written around 1136 by Geoffrey of Monmouth. Here, Merlin appears as a child prodigy who prophesies the fall of kingdoms and the future of Britain. Geoffrey fuses elements of Merlin Wlt with another legendary figure, Ambrosius Aurelianus, creating a new character, Merlinus Ambrosius. The fascinating thing is that Geoffrey does not present him as a fairy tale wizard, but as a biblical-style prophet, who interprets the destiny of the British people. The famous story of the red and white dragon fighting under a tower, which Merlin reveals as a prophecy of the conflict between Merlin is, probably, the most ambiguous character in the Arthurian cycle in religious terms. He is never clearly Christian, but he is not presented as an open pagan either. In some texts, it is hinted that he is the son of an incubus, a demonic spirit, and a human woman. This version, widespread in the Middle Ages, served to justify his prophetic powers. They did not come from God nor completely from the devil, but from a mixed lineage. This detail was very useful for Christian writers, as it allowed them to keep Merlin within the Arthurian universe without compromising dogma. In this way, Merlin represents a religious transition, from the ancient Celtic gods to Christianity. He is the bridge between the old world and the new. His wisdom is ancestral, but his message, at least in later literature, usually points to divine order, sacrifice, and repentance. Imagine a real sword, rusted by time, plunged into a rock in a small monastery in Italy. It's not a sculpture. It's the sword of a 12th century knight who, upon renouncing violence, plunged it into the stone. Is it possible that this real story, almost identical to that of King Arthur, is the true inspiration for the myth of the sword in the stone? The story of the sword in the stone, as we have seen, is not a modern invention, but a medieval creation. But was it a total invention or an adaptation of something that actually happened? In the Abbey of Montesipi in Tuscany, there is tangible proof that at least one story of a sword plunged into a rock is not only real, but is older than the Arthurian myth we all know. The sword of San Galgano is, for many, the most direct connection between fantasy and history. Its existence demonstrates that the image of a sword embedded in a stone was not just a literary device, but a powerful metaphor that resonated in the imagination of medieval Europe. And its story, surprisingly, has many echoes of the myth of Arthur. The knight who plunged the sword into the stone was not a prince, but a libertine nobleman who after a vision became a hermit. It is a story of transformation, faith, and repentance, and a possible key to understanding the real origin of the Excalibur myth. The story of San Galgano is fascinating in itself. Galgano Guidati was born in 1148 in Tuscany. He is said to have been an arrogant and violent knight, a libertine who enjoyed war and worldly pleasures. However, in 1180 he had a vision of Saint Michael the Archangel who ordered him to renounce his life of sin and become a hermit. At first, Galgano resisted and scoffed at the idea. To show how impossible his conversion was, he tried to plunge his sword into a rock as if trying to split it in two. To his amazement, the blade sank into the stone as if it were butter, becoming embedded in it up to the hilt. Galgano, moved by the miracle, repented, abandoned his former life and became a hermit in that same place. After his death, he was canonized by the church and his sword, a symbol of his conversion, became a sacred relic that attracted pilgrims from all over Europe. This is where the story intersects with the legend of Excalibur. Robert de Boron, the French poet who invented the story of the sword in the stone, wrote his work Merlin around the year 1190, just a decade after the death of San Galgano. The news of the miraculous sword in Italy spread throughout Europe, reaching the ears of poets and troubadours. It is very likely that Boron, in search of a powerful way to legitimize the young Arthur as king, was inspired by this real event. Unlike Galgano's story, where the sword symbolizes the renunciation of violence, Boron used it to symbolize the acceptance of power and the right to rule. The act is the same, but the meaning is diametrically opposed. Galgano's sword is plunged in for peace, while Arthur's is for war. This shows us that legends are not just copies of real events, but cultural reinterpretations that adapt to the needs of each era. The existence of the sword of San Galgano offers us an invaluable insight into the process of myth-making. It teaches us that legends, even the most fantastic, often have their roots in real events, rituals, or places. The image of the sword in the stone is not just a literary invention, but a powerful archetype that existed in the collective imagination of the Middle Ages. This image embodied the idea that sacred objects could interact with the material world in miraculous ways, and that a true leader could be revealed by a divine sign. The story of San Galgano is, therefore, a crucial piece in the Excalibur puzzle, a bridge between myth and reality that allows us to see how a simple sword was transformed into the most legendary in history. In the next chapter, we will explore the historical swords of Arthur's time, and look for the swords that could have been the material inspiration for Excalibur. What does archaeology reveal about the weapons of the Celtic kings? Join me because now the legend of Excalibur takes us to the battlefields of post-Roman Britain. Don't forget to subscribe, leave your like and turn on notifications. What if the legendary Excalibur was not an invention, but a real sword from antiquity, an object of power that actually existed? What have archaeologists found in the ruins of post-Roman Britain? On the battlefields of the time, swords were more than just sharpened metal. They were symbols of power and were often given a name. Are we about to discover the true material origin of the myth? The figure of King Arthur, as we have seen, has its origin in a dark and turbulent period of the history of Great Britain, the 5th and 6th centuries AD, after the withdrawal of the Roman legions. In this chaos, the Briton leaders fought for their survival against the Saxon invaders. In this context, a sword was not just a tool of war, it was a symbol of leadership. The powerful leaders of the time had high-quality swords, often imported from the continent, that stood out among the weapons of their followers. These swords, forged with skill, often had their own names, as has been documented in sagas and poems of the time. In excavations in Scotland and Ireland, archaeologists have discovered swords from the Iron Age and the post-Roman era with engravings of Celtic symbols and names written on their blades, which shows that the custom of naming swords was real. What other surprises await us? For the Celts, the material world and the spiritual world were closely connected. It was not uncommon for special powers to be attributed to swords, either because of the skill of the blacksmith who forged them, the rituals performed on them, or the history of the heroes who used them. Excalibur, or its precursor, was probably one of these swords. Its name, as we saw, Caeldfulch or hard in battle, suggests a sword of exceptional quality, one that stood out in combat. In this sense, archaeology has given us some fascinating clues about the swords of the time. Swords have been found in burial sites of the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon elite, often with elaborate handles of gold, silver, or jewel inlays. These weapons, clearly ceremonial and of great value, were not for daily combat, but to be brandished by a leader. It is possible that the Excalibur myth was based on one of these swords, a sword of prestige that belonged to a warrior leader and became a symbol of his power. The legend grew around it, and over time, its story merged with the magical elements of Celtic mythology. One of the most intriguing theories about the material origin of Excalibur has to do with the Sarmatians, a people of warrior horsemen of Iranian origin who served as mercenaries for the Roman Empire. Some historians suggest that the figure of Arthur could be based on a Sarmatian leader. The Sarmatians worshipped their god of war in the form of a sword plunged into the earth, an image that powerfully reminds us of the myth of the sword in the stone. The connection is speculative but fascinating. The myth of the sword in the stone could be an echo of a Sarmatian religious practice, which merged with the legend of a Briton leader to create the story of Arthur. The presence of the Sarmatians in Britain during the post-Roman era is a historical fact, and their culture could have left a mark on local folklore. The search for a real Excalibur is ultimately the search for a lost relic, a needle in a haystack. But every ancient sword found, every remnant of a fortified settlement, every mention in an ancient text brings us one step closer to the truth. The legend of Excalibur is not just about a sword, it is about an era of chaos, of heroic leaders, and of a people who clung to their heroes to find hope. In the next chapter we will explore the scabbard of Excalibur. Was it as important as the sword? And most importantly, what does the loss of the scabbard symbolize in Arthur's story? Subscribe and join me in unraveling the power behind the myth. Don't forget to turn on notifications. If the sword was the symbol of Arthur's power, the scabbard was the source of his invincibility. A magical object that protected him from death in battle. The scabbard of Excalibur is not a simple accessory, it is the key to understanding why Arthur's kingdom fell. And the story of its loss is one of the most tragic and revealing in the Arthurian myth. What secrets did this relic hide, and who was the figure who orchestrated its disappearance? In the popular imagination, Excalibur is the sword. Its scabbard, a mere complement. But in the original legends, the scabbard is as important as the blade, if not more so. In the work of Sir Thomas Malory, Le Morte d'Arthur, the wizard Merlin warns Arthur about the scabbard. I warn you, it is the scabbard of the sword that is worth more, because as long as you have it, you will not lose blood, no matter how badly you are wounded. This detail is crucial. Arthur's sword is the instrument of his power to conquer and rule, but the scabbard is the instrument of his survival. In a way, the scabbard represents the magical protection that the king enjoys, an invisible shield that makes him invulnerable. The scabbard is stolen by Morgana, Arthur's sister, who gives it to her lover, Sir Avalon. This betrayal not only causes a mortal wound to Arthur, but also initiates the chain of events that will culminate in the fall of Camelot. The story of the loss of the scabbard is one of the darkest and most psychologically complex in the Arthurian cycle. Morgana le Fay, Arthur's half-sister, is a figure of deep ambivalence. In the earliest tales, she is a healer and a benevolent sorceress. But in later versions she is transformed into Arthur's main antagonist, driven by jealousy, resentment, and a desire for revenge. Morgana's betrayal is not an impulsive act, but the result of a deep-seated enmity. She steals the scabbard and with it her brother's power. The loss of the scabbard is not a simple loss of a magical object. It is a metaphor for the loss of innocence, of Arthur's moral and political invulnerability. When Arthur faces his lover, Sir Avalon, in a duel, the latter is wearing the magical scabbard, stolen by Morgana. Arthur, without his protection, is seriously wounded. Although he finally manages to recover the scabbard and defeat Avalon, the damage is already done. The king has bled. The idea of Arthur's invulnerability has been broken. This event marks a turning point in the story. The magical protection has been lost, and from this moment on, Arthur's kingdom begins its slow and tragic fall. The loss of the scabbard symbolizes the end of the golden age of Camelot, an era of purity and absolute power that will never return. Don't miss it. Subscribe and join me in unraveling the power behind the myth. Don't forget to turn on notifications. Who was Merlin really? An old, white-bearded sage who lived in a castle? Or a much more complex figure, a Celtic prophet, a druid, a political strategist, a master of ceremonies who manipulated the threads of destiny for Arthur to become king? The story of Merlin is the key to understanding how a forgotten chieftain was transformed into the greatest legend of all time. Magic was not the end but the tool. And in this chapter, we will reveal the truth behind the wizard, to see the man who, with his cunning, forged the destiny of a nation. Merlin is the soul of the Arthurian myth. He is not just a secondary character, but the catalyst for everything that happens. He is the one who orchestrates Arthur's conception, the one who raises him in secret, the one who places the sword in the stone to legitimize his reign, the one who guides him in his early years. Without Merlin there is no Arthur. There is no Camelot. There is no Excalibur. But who was the inspiration for this character? There is not a single historical Merlin, but a mosaic of figures that medieval poets fused to create the character we know today. The roots of Merlin are found in Welsh poetry, in Celtic Druidic traditions, and in French literature. In ancient Welsh poetry, there is the figure of Merlin W. the Wild Merlin, a mad sage who, after witnessing the horrors of battle, retires to live in the forests, where he acquires prophetic powers. This ancestral character, an echo of the Celtic connection with nature, is the basis of everything we know about Merlin. The first time we see Merlin as a central character is in the 12th century, in the work of Geoffrey of Monmouth, Historia Regum Britanniae. Geoffrey, in writing about the history of the British kings, is inspired by a Welsh figure named Merlin Wlt, a legendary bard who went mad and retired to the forests after the Battle of Arthurid in the year 573. In the Welsh stories, Merlin is a prophet and a poet, a man who connects with nature and can see the future. Geoffrey fuses this mad bard with another historical figure, the Roman Briton leader Ambrosius Aurelianus, to create Merlinus Ambrosius, a young prophet who is able to interpret the secrets of the past and the future of Britain. It is he, in this version, who prophesies the fall of kingdoms and the triumph of Arthur, and who reveals the mystery of the two dragons, one red and one white, fighting under the ruins of a tower. This act of prophecy not only gives Merlin magical authority, but also legitimizes Geoffrey's work, giving it an air of historical veracity. But Merlin was not just a prophet. In later medieval literature, Merlin becomes a wizard. In the work of Robert de Boron, for example, Merlin is the son of a demon, incubus, and a virtuous woman. His powers come from his demonic lineage, but his soul is pure, which allows him to use his abilities for good. This version, with its Christian overtones, was very popular in the Middle Ages, as it allowed authors to explain Merlin's magical powers without falling into heresy. Merlin becomes the wizard who uses his magic to manipulate the world, to protect Arthur, to create the sword in the stone, and to found the kingdom of Camelot. His magic is a tool, not an end in itself. It is the engine that drives the narrative, that makes the impossible possible. But the story of Merlin has a dark side. In the work of Sir Thomas Malory, The Lady of the Lake, to whom Merlin teaches his secrets, betrays him and locks him in a magical prison forever. This act of betrayal, which marks Merlin's departure from the world, is a metaphor for the decline of magic in Arthur's world, and the beginning of the reign of reason and war. Merlin's disappearance is a crucial moment in the Arthurian myth. In Malory's version, Merlin falls in love with the Lady of the Lake, Vivian, and teaches her all his magical secrets. But she, who does not trust him, uses her knowledge to create a magical prison, a spell that traps him forever. This act is not just a personal betrayal, it is the disappearance of magic from Arthur's kingdom. From this moment on, Arthur must rule without the wizard's advice. The sword and Arthur's kingdom are no longer protected by magic. They now depend on the strength, strategy, and honor of the knights. It is the end of an era and the beginning of the end of the kingdom. Merlin's prison is the symbol of the loss of ancestral wisdom, of the disappearance of the supernatural, and of the end of the golden age of magic. The world becomes more prosaic, more violent, more human. Merlin is the character who unites all the threads of the Arthurian myth. His Celtic roots, his transformation into a prophet, his political manipulation, and his tragic disappearance show us that the myth of Arthur is not a simple story, but a complex network of cultural, historical, and literary influences. Merlin is the master of ceremonies who put Arthur on the throne. But he is also the prophet who saw the end of his kingdom. His story is the story of magic that disappears, of wisdom that is lost, and of a world that becomes darker and more human. In the next chapter we will explore the Round Table and Arthur's knights. Were they just a literary invention? Or was there a society of warriors that inspired the ideal of chivalry? Subscribe and join me in unraveling the power behind the myth. Don't forget to turn on notifications. The Round Table. A circle of knights, with no head or seats of honor, where all were equal. It is the heart of Arthur's kingdom, the symbol of an ideal: justice, honor, equality. But did it really exist? Or is it a poetic invention, a literary utopia, a dream of a social order that never came to be? In this chapter we will explore the origin of the Round Table and the ideals of chivalry that defined it, to see how a simple piece of furniture became the most powerful symbol of Arthurian justice. In the earliest legends of Arthur, the Round Table is not mentioned. The concept first appears in the work of the French poet Robert Was, in his 12th century work Roman de Brute. Was, in narrating the story of Arthur, introduces the idea that Arthur creates a round table to settle a dispute among his knights over the order of precedence. The table, being circular, had no head, which guaranteed that all the knights were equal in rank. This literary invention was a stroke of genius. The Round Table was not just a piece of furniture, but a powerful metaphor for an ideal society, a kingdom where merit and virtue were more important than lineage or title. In the Middle Ages, kings used to sit at tables with a head, with the most important knights at their side, which caused countless disputes over rank. Was, with his invention, created a utopia, a solution to a very real problem of the medieval nobility. The ideal of chivalry that was associated with the Round Table was also, in large part, a literary construct. In the early Middle Ages, knights were not the noble warriors we know. They were, for the most part, brutal mercenaries, dedicated to looting and private war. The Church, concerned about endemic violence, began to promote a new code of conduct, which is known as the Code of Chivalry. This code, which became popular through the Arthurian romances, included ideals such as the protection of the weak, the defense of the faith, honor, loyalty, and justice. The Knight of the Round Table became the epitome of this ideal, a role model for the European nobility. The Round Table became the center of all the exploits of Arthur's knights. From epic quests such as that of the Holy Grail, to duels for honor, everything revolved around the table. It was the place where the knights swore their vows, where their stories were told, and where the commitment to Arthur's ideal was renewed. The Round Table was not just an object, it was a community, a brotherhood, a dream of a more just and noble society. But the Round Table was also the scene of betrayal and tragedy. The story of Lancelot and Queen Guinevere's infidelity, which happens within this circle, is the catalyst for the fall of Camelot. The ideal is broken from within, showing that even the most perfect society can be destroyed by human passions. The Round Table is a symbol of a utopian ideal. And like every utopia, it is destined to fail. The story of Lancelot and Guinevere's betrayal, and that of Mordred's betrayal, are a reminder that human nature is fallible. The ideal of the Round Table is broken by the envy, adultery, and betrayal of its own members. The perfect circle is shattered and with it, the kingdom. In the next chapter we will explore Lancelot and Guinevere. Who were these tragic lovers? And how did their story of forbidden love lead to the collapse of Camelot? Subscribe and join me in unraveling the power behind the myth. Don't forget to turn on notifications. In the heart of Camelot, while Arthur and his knights fought for honor and justice, a secret passion bloomed that would destroy everything. Lancelot du Lac, the best of the knights of the Round Table, and Queen Guinevere, Arthur's wife, loved each other with a devotion that rivaled the loyalty they owed the king. Their love was not a simple romance, it was a destructive force that symbolized the fragility of the ideals of chivalry, a sin that would corrode the kingdom from within. The story of their love and betrayal is the true tragedy of the Arthurian myth, a story that reminds us that even the greatest kingdoms can be brought down by human passions. The forbidden love between Lancelot and Guinevere is one of the most enduring elements of the Arthurian myth, and one that has been interpreted in many ways over the centuries. In the earliest versions of the legend, Lancelot does not exist. The story of Guinevere's infidelity first appears in the works of the French poet Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century. Chrétien, in creating Lancelot, not only gave the queen a lover, but also created the perfect knight, the epitome of chivalry. Lancelot was brave, honorable, loyal, and the best of all warriors, but his love for Guinevere led him to betray his king, the man to whom he had sworn loyalty. The love of Lancelot and Guinevere is the engine of the entire plot of Le Morte d'Arthur. It is the spark that ignites the rivalry, the betrayal, the conflict that separates the knights, and that, ultimately, leads to the fall of Camelot. Adultery is not just a sin, it is the cause of the ruin of an entire kingdom. The love story of Lancelot and Guinevere is the catalyst for the fall of the Round Table. The queen's infidelity, which becomes a public scandal, divides Arthur's knights into two sides: those who support Lancelot and Guinevere, and those who remain loyal to the king. Loyalty becomes ambiguous, and the code of chivalry, which was based on honesty and virtue, is broken. The internal division in Arthur's kingdom is the real cause of its fall. Lancelot and Guinevere are not the villains of the story, but the victims of their own passion. Their love is a force so powerful that it overcomes reason and duty, and leads them to betray the king who gave them everything. The end of the story is a tragedy. Arthur, forced to act, must judge Guinevere for adultery. Before she can be executed, Lancelot rescues her, but in the process he kills several knights of the Round Table, including the brother of Sir Gawain. This act of irreparable violence divides the kingdom forever. While Arthur pursues Lancelot, his nephew Mordred, who has been plotting his betrayal for a long time, takes the opportunity to usurp the throne. The kingdom, divided by love and betrayal, collapses into a civil war. The Round Table is destroyed, the knights kill each other, and the golden age of Camelot comes to an end. In the next chapter we will explore Mordred. Was he really the villain who killed Arthur? Or was he an illegitimate son, a product of betrayal and incest, who simply claimed what he believed was his by right? Subscribe and join me in unraveling the power behind the myth. Don't forget to turn on notifications. Every great hero needs a villain, and in the myth of King Arthur, that role belongs to Mordred. He is described as the traitor, the incestuous bastard, the usurper who killed Arthur and destroyed the kingdom. But is this the whole truth? Or was Mordred a tragic character, an illegitimate son, a product of destiny and betrayal who simply claimed what he believed was his by right? In this chapter we will unveil the figure of Mordred, to understand the man who, instead of being simply evil, may have been the inevitable consequence of Arthur's sins. In the earliest versions of the myth, Mordred is an ambiguous figure. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's work, Historia Regum Britanniae, Mordred is a secondary character, Arthur's nephew, to whom he entrusts the kingdom when he goes to war. Mordred betrays him, and in the final battle both kill each other. But it is in later literature, particularly in the work of Sir Thomas Malory, Le Morte d'Arthur, where Mordred becomes the villain we know. Malory introduces the idea of incest. Arthur, unknowingly, sleeps with his half-sister Morgana, and from that union Mordred is born. This version, with its biblical and moral overtones, transforms Mordred from a simple traitor into a curse, the result of an original sin that haunts Arthur until the end. The figure of Mordred is a paradox. He is born of incest, Arthur's greatest sin, and yet he is his natural heir, the only one who could have claimed the throne by right of blood. The story of Mordred is that of a king who creates his own destroyer, a prophecy that fulfills itself. The myth of Mordred is a warning about the arrogance and consequences of past sins. Merlin warns Arthur that the son born of his incestuous union will destroy the kingdom. Arthur, upon learning of the prophecy, tries to drown all the children born on the same date, but Mordred survives, only to return years later to exact his revenge. This attempt to avoid destiny only serves to ensure that it is fulfilled. Mordred grows up with a deep resentment towards the king who tried to kill him, and his betrayal is not an act of pure evil, but a twisted search for justice. He feels entitled to the throne, and he uses Arthur's weaknesses, his love for Guinevere and his inability to see the betrayal, to bring him down. In Malory's version, Mordred is the one who discovers the forbidden love of Lancelot and Guinevere. He is the one who exposes it, and who uses the scandal to divide the Round Table and usurp the throne. In the final battle on the plain of Camlan, Arthur faces Mordred. The battle is a massacre, a clash between good and evil, between the king and his traitor. Arthur, mortally wounded, manages to kill Mordred, but in the process he also receives a fatal wound. The death of both on the battlefield is the end of a cycle, the end of the golden age of Camelot, and a reminder that the sins of the past always come back to collect their price. In the next chapter we will explore the fate of Arthur. Did he die at Camlin? Or was he taken to the magical island of Avalon, where he waits for the day his people need him? Join me because now the story of Excalibur takes us to the end of the road, or to the beginning of a new one. Subscribe and join me in unraveling the power behind the myth. Don't forget to turn on notifications. The battle is over. The blood of the Knights of the Round Table soaks the land of Camlin. Mordred lies dead and Arthur, mortally wounded, is on the shore of the lake, clinging to his last relic, Excalibur. But the sword, the symbol of his power, cannot die with him. It must return from whence it came. The story of Excalibur's return to the lake is the poetic end of an era, a final act of faith and sacrifice that closes the cycle of the legend. It is a sad ending, but also a reminder that true magic never dies, it only waits for the moment to return. The final battle of Camlin is the culmination of the Arthurian tragedy. In the most dramatic versions, only Arthur and his last loyal knight, Sir Bedivere, survive the massacre. The kingdom is lost, the ideal of the Round Table has been broken, and the king, mortally wounded, knows that his time has come to an end. In this moment of despair, Arthur asks Bedivere to take Excalibur and return it to the lake, to the lady who gave it to him. The sword, the symbol of his power and legitimacy, cannot fall into the hands of the kingdom's enemies. It must return to its origin. The act of returning the sword to the lake is a moment of deep ambiguity. Bedivere, the last knight, is tempted by the beauty and value of Excalibur. He hides it, lies to Arthur, and tells him that he has returned it. It is a story of human fragility, temptation, and the struggle between duty and desire. And his failure to return the sword in time is a reminder that even the most loyal can be corrupted. In Sir Thomas Malory's version, Bedivere, tempted by the splendor of the sword, hides it twice. The first time he hides it under a tree. Arthur, sensing the lie, asks him what he saw. Bedivere, ashamed, admits that he saw nothing. The second time he hides it under a rock and again Arthur asks him the same thing. Bedivere, unable to overcome his greed, lies to him again. Only on the third attempt, Bedivere, ashamed of his own weakness, manages to throw the sword into the water. And at that moment, a hand, that of the Lady of the Lake, emerges from the waters and catches the sword. The final act of the legend is not a victory but a farewell. The return of Excalibur to the lake symbolizes the end of the age of magic. The sword, the object that legitimized the kingdom, withdraws from a world that has succumbed to violence, betrayal, and war. It is a purification, an act of closure, the end of a cycle. But it is also an act of hope. The myth tells us that the sword and the king who brandished it are not lost forever. They wait in a mystical place, the island of Avalon, for the moment to return. The myth of Excalibur's return is the promise that Arthur's ideal, although broken by betrayal, will never die. It will always be there, waiting for the day the land needs it again. In the next chapter we will explore the fate of Arthur. Did he die at Camlin? Or was he taken to the magical island of Avalon, where he waits for the day his people need him? Join me because now the story of Excalibur takes us to the end of the road, or to the beginning of a new one. Subscribe and join me in unraveling the power behind the myth. Don't forget to turn on notifications. Arthur is not dead, he only sleeps. So says the legend. But where does King Arthur sleep? And what does his absence mean? After the Battle of Camlin, Queen Morgana's magical chariot takes Arthur, mortally wounded, to a mystical place, an island shrouded in mist. A place where magic still exists, where wounds are healed and time does not pass. This is the legend of Avalon, the Celtic paradise, the place where the king waits for the day his people need him. In this chapter we will unravel the mystery of Avalon and the hope that the myth of Arthur's absence represents, an echo of the need for a hero in times of despair. The legend of Arthur's death is as complex as his life. In some versions he dies in the Battle of Camlin and is buried in Glastonbury. In others his body is not found. But the most powerful version, the one that has endured in the collective memory, is that of his journey to Avalon. This idea first appears in the work of Geoffrey of Monmouth, Historia Regum Britanniae, where Arthur is taken to the island of Avalon to be healed of his wounds. In later tales, this island becomes a place of legend, a mystical paradise, the Island of Apples, where magic still flourishes and heroes await their moment to return. The story of the absence of the king is a recurring myth in European culture, an archetype of hope in times of crisis. Frederick Barbarossa sleeps in a mountain, King Sebastian waits to return to Portugal, and Arthur sleeps in Avalon. The idea is always the same. the hero has not died, he only waits for the moment to return to save his people. Avalon, the magical island, has been associated with several real places over the centuries. In the 12th century, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey claimed to have found the tomb of Arthur and Guinevere, and this discovery, although it was probably a deception to attract pilgrims, cemented the idea that Glastonbury was Arthur's final resting place. Glastonbury Abbey, with its mystical history and its connections to the legend of Joseph of Arimathea and the Holy Grail, became a place of pilgrimage and a center of the Arthurian myth. But the legend of Avalon persists. The myth of Arthur in Avalon is a powerful metaphor for hope. The king has not died, his ideal has not been lost. He is waiting, in a place where time does not run, for the moment to return. This idea became very popular in the Middle Ages, at a time when Great Britain was divided by war and conflict. The idea that the legitimate king, the king who united the nation, would one day return to bring peace and justice, was a beacon of hope for a people who were suffering. The myth of Avalon is a reminder that truth and honor never die, they only wait for the moment to return. In the next chapter, we will explore the influence of the Excalibur myth on popular culture. How has the legend been adapted and reinterpreted in cinema, literature, and video games? And why does the story of the magical sword continue to resonate in our hearts? Subscribe and join me in unraveling the power behind the myth. Don't forget to turn on notifications. From Walt Disney's animations to Netflix's television series, the legend of Excalibur and King Arthur has captured the imagination of generations. The story of a young man who pulls a sword from a stone to become king is a universal archetype that has been adapted and reinterpreted countless times. But why does this story, born in the darkness of the Middle Ages, continue to resonate in our hearts? What does the persistence of Excalibur in popular culture reveal about our own desires and aspirations? In this chapter, we will explore how the legend of Arthur and his sword has been transformed in cinema, television, video games, and modern literature, and why the myth of the magical sword is still so relevant in the 21st century. The first time many of us heard about Arthur was through cinema. The 1963 Disney film, The Sword in the Stone, is the most famous and perhaps the most important adaptation of the myth. The film, which focuses on Arthur's childhood and his relationship with Merlin, presents the story of the sword in the stone as a fairy tale, a fable about destiny and magic. The film removed the violence and tragedy of the original versions, creating a version of the myth that was accessible to children, and that became the way millions of people became familiar with the legend of Arthur. The influence of this film is immense. The image of a young and clumsy wart, pulling the sword out effortlessly has become the canonical version of the story. In the 1980s, a film changed the way we saw Arthur. John Boorman, in his masterpiece Excalibur, adapted the legend in an epic, adult, and bloody way. The film, which focuses on the myth in its entirety from Arthur's conception to his death, is one of the most iconic representations of the legend. The film popularized the image of the sword as an object of magical power, and that of the scabbard as its protective counterpart. The symbolism of the scabbard and its loss became a central theme of the film, which showed that the myth, in the hands of a visionary director, could be a vehicle for exploring complex themes. On television, the British series Merlin, which aired between 2008 and 2012, reinvented the legend in a more modern and youthful way. The series focuses on the friendship of a young Merlin and a young Arthur, and explores the formation of the kingdom and the Round Table from a fresh perspective. The series, which took many liberties with the original story, was a success with audiences, and showed that the legend of Arthur, with its themes of destiny, friendship, and betrayal, was still relevant to a new generation. In video games, Excalibur is an archetype. From King's Quest to Final Fantasy, the magical sword that a hero must find to save the kingdom is a recurring trope. The 2017 video game Assassin's Creed Origins, which is set in 9th century Britain, presents Excalibur as a piece of Eden of alien origin, a nod to the idea that the sword is not of human origin. This reinterpretation, although radical, shows that the legend continues to be a source of inspiration for storytellers. And in modern literature, the legend of Arthur has been reinterpreted in countless ways. T.H. White, in his novel The Once and Future King, reinvents the story as a political allegory, a reflection on war and peace. Marion Zimmer Bradley, in her work The Mists of Avalon, tells the story from the perspective of women, transforming Morgana and Guinevere from villains into heroines. These reinterpretations show that the myth of Excalibur is not a relic of the past, but a mirror of our own concerns and aspirations. The legend of Excalibur and King Arthur persists because it is a story of hope. It is the story of a young man who, without lineage or power, pulls a sword from a stone and becomes the best king Great Britain has ever known. It is a reminder that great leaders can come from the most unexpected places, and that a single act of virtue can change the destiny of a nation. The story of Excalibur is the story of a utopia, of an ideal of justice that, although never fulfilled, continues to inspire us to believe in the possibility of a better world. In the next chapter we will explore the relationship between myth and history, and how the line that separates them is thinner than we think. What does the persistence of Excalibur reveal about the way we build our own identity? Subscribe and join me in unraveling the power behind the myth. Don't forget to turn on notifications. Excalibur is not just a sword. It is an archetype. A symbol that has existed in the mind of humanity long before King Arthur became a legend. It is the power of the hero, manifest destiny, the tool that turns an ordinary man into a king. And in this chapter we are going to explore the mythology of steel, to understand how the idea of a magical sword that grants the right to rule has been repeated again and again in cultures all over the world. From the swords of mythological heroes to warrior deities, the story of Excalibur is the story of a universal belief. Power resides in the sword, and the sword chooses its owner. The idea of a magical sword is not exclusive to the Arthurian myth. In Norse mythology, the god Odin gives his son a magical weapon called Gram, a sword that is so sharp it can cut steel. In Irish mythology, the hero Cuchulainn possesses a magical sword called Cruadin Catuchin. In Greek mythology, the hero Perseus kills the Gorgon Medusa with a sword that was given to him by the gods. In Japanese mythology, the god Susanoo kills an 8-headed dragon with a sacred sword called Kusanagi no Tsurugi, a sword that becomes one of the 3 imperial relics of Japan. What all these stories have in common is the idea of a sword that is not just a weapon but a sacred object. A sword that is forged by the gods or given by a deity, or found in a sacred place. It is the sword that chooses the hero. It is a symbol of a power that is greater than the hero himself. The sword as a symbol of power and the right to rule is an idea that dates back to the most ancient civilizations. In ancient Egypt, the scepter of the pharaohs was a symbol of their divine authority. In ancient Rome, the right to use a sword was a privilege of citizens. In medieval Europe, the sword was the symbol of chivalry, honor, and power. The act of handing a sword to a young knight was a rite of initiation, a ceremony that marked his entry into the world of warriors. The story of Excalibur is the culmination of all these ideas. It is a story that combines the mysticism of the swords of mythological heroes with the politics of medieval succession to the throne. The sword in the stone is not just a test of strength, but a revelation of a destiny. It is the symbol of an authority that does not come from blood, but from a divine choice. The story of Excalibur is a story about the legitimacy of power, about the idea that a true leader is one who is chosen by destiny, not by inheritance. In the next chapter we will explore the relationship between myth and history, and how the line that separates them is thinner than we think. What does the persistence of Excalibur reveal about the way we build our own identity? Subscribe and join me in unraveling the power behind the myth. Don't forget to turn on notifications. The search for Excalibur is the search for a needle in a haystack. But what if that needle wasn't in a haystack but at the bottom of a lake? Or buried under the ruins of an ancient castle? In this chapter we will explore the archaeology of myth, to understand what archaeologists have found in the places associated with the legend of Arthur. From the ruins of Tintagel to the mystical Dosmary Lake, the search for Excalibur is the search for a symbol that, although it may never be found, continues to reveal truths about history, culture, and the way myths are rooted in the earth. The search for Excalibur is, for many, an exercise of faith. Not a single fragment of metal has been found that can be attributed to the sword of King Arthur. But the lack of evidence has not stopped archaeologists. The places associated with the legend, such as Tintagel and Glastonbury, have been excavated for centuries, and although no magical artifacts have been found, the discoveries have helped to contextualize the legend, to give it a historical basis. In the ruins of Tintagel, archaeologists have found the remains of a monumental building, and fragments of ceramics imported from the Mediterranean. These findings do not prove that Arthur existed, but they do show that in the era in which, according to the chronicles, Arthur would have lived, Tintagel was an important center of power, a place worthy of a king. In Glastonbury Abbey, 12th-century monks claimed to have found the tomb of Arthur and Guinevere, and their discovery became a magnet for pilgrims. The tomb was visited by kings and nobles, and its existence became proof of Arthur's historicity. Although modern historians believe that the discovery was a hoax, the story of the Glastonbury tomb is an example of how a myth can influence history, and how people in the search for truth are often willing to believe what they want to believe. Dosmery Lake in Cornwall has been associated with the legend of Excalibur. It is in this lake where, according to legend, Bedivere returned the sword to the Lady of the Lake. And although no magical swords have been found, archaeologists have found in other lakes in the area remains of ancient swords that were ritually deposited in the water. These findings show that the practice of throwing swords into the water was real, and that the story of the Lady of the Lake could be an echo of a forgotten Celtic ritual. The search for Excalibur, ultimately, is not about finding a sword. It is about finding the origin of a myth, the truth behind a legend. It is about understanding how a simple object can become a symbol of power, justice, and hope. It is about understanding how myths are rooted in the earth, and how history and fantasy intertwine to create the stories that define us. In the next chapter, we will explore the relationship between myth and history, and how the line that separates them is thinner than we think. What does the persistence of Excalibur reveal about the way we build our own identity? Subscribe and join me in unraveling the power behind the myth. Don't forget to turn on notifications. We have traveled through the centuries, from the mists of post-Roman Britain to the fantasy of medieval novels, searching for the truth behind the most famous sword in history. We have unearthed archaeological clues, unraveled the symbolism of the scabbard, explored the origins of the wizard Merlin and the tragic love of Lancelot. And after all this journey, we are faced with a final question. Does it really matter if Excalibur existed? Does it matter if King Arthur was a real chieftain or a literary invention? The answer is no. What matters is not the literal truth but the symbolic truth. In this chapter, we will explore the relationship between myth and history, to understand how legends, even the most fantastic, often reveal more about ourselves than about the past. The myth of Excalibur and King Arthur is not a simple story, it is a cultural tool, a way of understanding our own identity. The legend of Arthur, with his ideal of justice, his search for the Holy Grail, and the fall of his kingdom through betrayal, is a mirror of our own aspirations and fears. It is the story of a king who creates a utopian kingdom, and how that kingdom collapses due to human passions. It is a warning about the fragility of ideals and a celebration of hope. The myth of Excalibur is the belief that, in the darkest of times, a hero can emerge from nowhere to restore justice and hope. Legends are not lies. They are truths disguised as fairy tales. And the story of Excalibur is one of those truths. It is the truth that a leader is not born, he is made. It is the truth that legitimate power does not come from blood, but from honor and virtue. And it is the truth that, although kingdoms fall and heroes die, their ideals can last forever. The persistence of the Excalibur myth in popular culture demonstrates its power. The story of the sword in the stone, the wizard Merlin, and the Knights of the Round Table continues to resonate in our hearts because it speaks of universal themes: destiny, betrayal, love, hope, and redemption. The legend of Excalibur is the story of the search for an ideal that, although never fully achieved, inspires us to be better, to fight for justice, and to believe in the possibility of a better world. And with this, we come to our last chapter. In it, we will summarize everything we have learned and bring this journey to a close. How has Excalibur evolved from a simple sword to a symbol of hope? And why is its story still so relevant in the 21st century? Subscribe and join me in unraveling the power behind the myth. Don't forget to turn on notifications. We have reached the end of our journey. We have unearthed the origins of Excalibur, from the mists of Celtic mythology to the literary inventions of the Middle Ages. We have traced the evolution of the sword, from an object of ritual power to a symbol of monarchy and finally, to a universal archetype. We have explored the characters who surround it: Merlin, the Lady of the Lake, Lancelot, and the tragic figure of Mordred. And at the end of this journey, one thing is clear. The story of Excalibur is not the story of an object, but of an idea. It is the story of how a myth, through the centuries, became one of the most powerful stories in Western culture. Excalibur, as we have seen, is not a single sword. It is the fusion of two stories, that of the sword in the stone, a metaphor for the divine right to rule, and that of the sword of the lake, an echo of Celtic rituals and ancestral magic. This amalgam of stories is what gave Excalibur its power. It was not just the sword of a king, but a sword that was a symbol of justice, destiny, and supernatural protection. It was the sword that legitimized Arthur, and the one that made him invincible. But the story of Excalibur is also the story of its loss. The loss of the scabbard, stolen by Morgana, marked the beginning of the end of the kingdom. The betrayal of Lancelot and Guinevere, and the ambition of Mordred, broke the Round Table and destroyed the ideal of Camelot. The story of the sword, of its rise and fall, is a reflection of the history of Arthur's kingdom. an era of magic, honor, and justice, which ultimately succumbs to human passions. And the end of the story, the return of Excalibur to the lake, is not a sad ending. It is a poetic ending, an act of closure, a reminder that true magic does not die, but waits for the moment to return. The story of Excalibur is the story of hope, of a king who did not die, but went to the island of Avalon, where he waits for the day his people need him again. The myth of Excalibur and King Arthur is not a relic of the past, but a mirror of our own desires and aspirations. It is the story of a king who earns his crown with honor, of a kingdom that seeks justice, and of a sword that, although it never existed, continues to shine with the light of hope. Excalibur is not just a legend. It is a truth about the power of ideals, the fragility of human nature, and the eternal hope that, in the darkest of times, a hero can emerge from nowhere and bring magic back to our world.